You're watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, art everywhere present and fills all things, treasury, blessings, and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Tuesday. We are getting back started with the basics of biblical Hebrew here, joined with Louis Dizon. Welcome back to the show, Louis. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great. Excited to continue this series.
Yeah, it's been a little while. We've both had a pretty busy schedule, but we're getting back into the swing of things. So here we are. I think we're going over chapter 12 and 13 from the book today.
Yes, that is correct. So
Awesome.
Hopefully those of you who are watching have had time to digest the previous session, and we'll be building off of that. Now that we're acquainted with the verbal system, we will deal with the most common verb stem, which is the call stem. And we can. I'm ready to get started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just turn on the share screen.
Sure.
Let me see. All right. So to begin with, we're going to continue our series of translation exercises where we're going through the Joseph story. So if you recall, in the previous session, we translated Genesis 39, which is the Potiphar story, and now we are going into Genesis chapter 40, which is where Joseph interprets the dreams. So here we have the vocab for this particular session. Those are the new words that are going to come up. And for those who've read in English, this is what happens after Joseph is accused of trying to rape his master's wife. He gets thrown into prison, and while he's there, he interprets some dreams. So let's look at that story in Hebrew, shall we? And while we're doing that, we're going to make note of some of the verbs because verbs are one of the main things that we're trying to learn about at the moment. So to begin, let's look at verse 1. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ele chat'u mishke melech Mitzrayim ve'ha'ofe le'adonehem lemelech Mitzrayim. So the verbs here would be vayhi and chat'i, and let me see. Yep, those two. So it was. So this comes from Haya. This is the Vaiktol or Vav, the preterite form of that. And then after these words, so devarim means actually these things rather. So the word devar typically means word, but can also mean things. So in this context, it means the thing. So it was after these things, and the cupbearer here, he sinned against, or he transgressed against Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, and so did the baker Ha'ofe to their lord, the king of Egypt. So verse 2, Vayichar af Paro al shne srisav al sar hamashkim va'al sar ha'ofim. So Vayichar af, and Pharaoh's literally it's like Pharaoh's nose or countenance became hot, but this is just a Hebrew way of saying became angry. So Pharaoh became angry at the two of his officials, um, and upon the Tsar of the Hamashkim. Actually, let me see again, what does mashkim mean. Mashke. So the cupbearers, and upon the prince of the bakers. So, and then in verse 3, Vaiten otam bamishmar bet sar hatabachim al bet hasohar makom asher Yosef sham. And he gave. So Vaiten comes from the word Natan. Actually, the other verb here. Actually, that's the only verb here there. So he gave them into the mishmar. So this is confinement. So he threw them into confinement or into prison. The house of the prince of the tabachim. Tabachim is like it's like cooks, and to the house of the prison. So he threw them into prison, basically. The place, and that was the Makom Asher Yosef Sham, the place which Joseph was. Verse 4, Vayifkod Sar Hatabachim et Yosef Itam Vayisharet Otam Vayihyu Yamim B'mishmar. And actually, the Bachim here, actually, it's more like the, let me see again. So, let me see. I've actually forgot what that vocab word means. Let's take a look at the English translation really quickly. Yeah, actually, it's the captain of the guard. There we go. I was thinking of the word for cook for some reason because it's similar to that. So this is the captain of the guard. So he attended to the captain of the guard, that is to say Joseph did, with him, and he served them, and they were Vayihyu Yamim, and there were days. So it's like there were many days in basically in captivity or confinement. Yeah. Verse 5. V'yachalmu chalom shnehem ish chalomo balayla echad ish kafitron chalomo hamashke haofe. So, and they dreamt a dream, the two of them. So the two of them dreamt a dream. A man, his dream at night, one man as the Pitron. Let me see, I'm blanking. Let's look at the meaning of that again. Pitron means interpretation. A man as the interpretation of his dream. The cupbearer and the baker. So both the baker and the cupbearer had a dream in this verse. Asher Lamelech Mitzrayim, Asher Bavet Hasohar, which is to the king of Egypt, which is in the house of the prison, or the prison house. Verse 6. Vayavo alehem Yosef baboker vayar otam vehine pnehem ra'im. And Joseph went to them. So Yavo comes from Ba'a, means to go, in the morning, and he saw them, and behold, their faces were evil, which is a which is a more, if more colloquially, their faces were sullen. They didn't look very good. So we've got multiple verbs here: vayavo, vayar. So this was he went and he saw. And then in verse 7, Vaish'al et srise paro asher ito ba mishmor or mishmar bet adonav lemor madua pnehem ra'im hayom. So Yish'al from Sha'al means to ask. So he asked, and so he asked the two officials of Pharaoh, which were with him in prison or in captivity, of the house of their Lord, to say, why are your faces bad today? And of course, here is where we start getting the dreams. So verse 8, Vayamru, ki chalom chalmu ve'en ish asher yiftor oto, vayomer alehem Yosef, halo le'elohim pitron, vayish'al otam al hachalomot. So let's look. The verbs here would be this and this. So Vayomru is they said. Yiftor is he interprets. Vayomer is he said, and Vayish'al is he asked. So notice that most of these are the Vaiktol form or the preterite form, and only one is an imperfect form right here. So let's translate this. Vayamru, and they said, because we dreamt a dream and there is no man who can interpret it. And Joseph said to them, is not the interpretation the Lord's? And he asked them about the dreams. Verse 9, Vaisaper sar hamashkim et chalomo leYosef vayomer ki bachalomo haya gefen lefanav. And so we've got Vaisaper and vayomer, haya and haya. So this is, and he recounted, and vayomer is, and he told, and haya is it was. So let's translate. And the chief cupbearer recounted his dream to Joseph, and he said, because his dream was basically like grapes before him. There were grapes before him, or like a vineyard, rather. Yeah, it's basically a vine where grapes are growing. And then verse 10, Uvagefen shlosha sarigim uvahem anavim. And in the vine were 3 sarigim, which are 3 branches, and in them were grapes. So an inav is a grape, plural is anavim. So 3 branches with grapes in them. Verse 11, Vekos paro biyado vaikach et ha'anavim vayischat otam el kos paro vayiten et hakos lefaro. So, and Pharaoh's cup was in his hand, and he took the grapes, and he basically squeezed the grapes, squeezed them into the cup of Pharaoh, and he gave the cup to Pharaoh. So a lot of verbs there. Verse 12, Vaisaper lo יוסף זה פתרון החלום שלושה הסרגים שלושה ימים הם. And Joseph recounted to him this interpretation. The dream, this interpretation of the dream, the three branches are 3 days. Verse 13, Ba'od shloshet yamim vayisa paro et roshecha vahu yishte mikos asher beyadcha ke varishona kaasher ata mashkehu. And again, in 3 days, again, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and he will drink from the cup which is in your hand. So, biyadecha, you recall the word yad is hand. There's the preposition but for in, and the second person suffix ka. And just as was at first, so Rishona in first, and just as you were his cupbearer. And then in verse 14, Vayish'al mimenu Yosef ki yizkor oto ka'asher yitav lo ve'asa imo chaser ve'amar alav el paro lama'an yetze min habaytahu. And he asked of him, and Joseph asked of him, that he remember him just as he did good to him, and he did with him loving kindness or mercy. So this is the word chesed, well-known Hebrew word. It has to do with goodness and mercy or loving kindness. And he said about him to Pharaoh, in order that he would go out from this house. So this is the verse where Joseph is asking the cupbearer to put in a good word for him before the Pharaoh, so that he'd be released. We know how that one ends. Verse 15, Vaysaper Yosef el ha'anashim ki lakhu oto me'eretz ha'ivrim vegam b'mitzrayim lo asa ma'uma ki samu oto babor. And here Joseph recounted to the men that they took him from the land of the Hebrews. Ivrim is Hebrews. And then in Egypt, and he did not do anything because they placed him in the well. So it was basically recounting the story. And then in verse 16, Vayar Sar Ha'ofim Ki Tov Patar Vayomer El Yosef Af Ba Chalomi Vehine Shlosha Salim Al Roshi. And the head baker saw that the patar, that the interpretation was good, and he said to Joseph, it's like, just like as well my dream, and behold, 3 salim, it's like baskets, 3 baskets were upon my head. And verse 17, Uva salim mikol ma'akal paro ma'ase ofe ve'ha'of achal otam min hasal me'al roshi. So, and in the baskets, the salim, from every food of Pharaoh, And so all of Pharaoh's food was in the baskets. And then doing like baking. So all of the bread, was in the baskets, and then the birds ate them from the baskets, which was upon my head. So he dreamt that the birds basically ate from the basket in his head. Verse 18. Vayomer Yosef ze pitrono shloshet salim. And Joseph said, this is its interpretation of the 3 baskets. And then shloshet yamimhem. They are 3 days. Verse 19. V'od shloshet yamim yisa paro et roshcha me'alecha ve'tala otcha al etz ve'achal ha'of et be'sarcha me'alecha. So, and again, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and let's see how that turns out, from upon you. So Pharaoh's basically going to take off his head, and he will hang you upon the tree, and the birds will eat basarcha, basically eat your flesh from you. So basar is flesh. So you can see the baker has a very different result from the cupbearer's dream, and we'll see how that unfolds in verse 20. Vayhi bayom hashlishi vayas paro mishte lechol avadav vayisa et rosh sar hamashkim ve'et rosh sar haofim betoch avadav. So it was, Vayhi, in the 3rd day, and Pharaoh did it's like a drink to all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the head cupbearer, and the head of the baker from the midst of his servants. All right, and then verse 21, Vayasem et sar hamashkim al mashkehu vaiten hakos al kaf paro. And he set. So the word seam is for to set or to place. So he placed the head cupbearer in the midst of mashkehu. It's like his cupbearers, and he gave the cup upon the hand of Pharaoh. So he got his job back, basically. And about the other guy, we see, Ve'et sar ha'ofim tala ka'asher patar lahem Yosef. And the head baker, he hanged, just as Joseph interpreted to them. So it didn't end well for him. And finally, we have the concluding verse. V'lo zachar sar hamashkim et Yosef vayishkach oto. However, he did not remember, that is to say, the sar hamashkim, the head of the cupbearers, did not remember Yosef, and he forgot him. So shachach means to forget. So you can see how it's getting more actiony now, and you can tell it's actiony from all the verbs that we have been seeing. Just the last couple of verses, we got these 4: tala, which is to hang; patar, which is to interpret; zachar, which is to remember; and yishkach means to forget. And you also get a good number of different forms of verbs. You have perfects, you have imperfects, and then you have um, the vital form, or the preterite form, which we translate as a perfective, even though it looks imperfect in its form. And we'll learn why that is later on. So we will go from that to the actual grammar portion of this exercise, this session, and we're covering chapters 12 and 13. So chapter 12 we'll try to go through really quickly. You may recall several sessions back that we discussed vowel changes, and there were various rules for vowel change that governed nouns. And with verbs, the rules are slightly different. So the first two rules are still the same. A closed unaccented syllable requires a short vowel. And so there's a distant open syllable. Now the difference is what you do with the immediate one syllable before the accent. So this is where it's different. You lengthen it for nouns, but you reduce it for verbs. But then there's an exception here. You lengthen it for A-class vowels and preformative vowels. So that's one of the ways that you learn the difference. You can tell if something is a noun versus a verb, which is whether the penultimate syllable, assuming it's open, lengthens or reduces. So this stuff is fairly advanced. So the authors of this textbook believe that it's important to introduce it early on, which is funny because, as I mentioned in the past, you don't really cover, you really don't make much use of vowel changes until you're much more advanced in Hebrew, because if you're just a beginner or intermediate Hebrew learner, this stuff doesn't come up much. But if you're going deep into like Hebrew philology and linguistics, this actually becomes important to make note of. The main use of it, again, being to distinguish words that might otherwise look identical, such as chochoma, chochama, and chochma. And of course, like every rule, there are exceptions. And the apparent exceptions exist because of certain secondary modifications. So the textbook says right here that these are advanced concepts. So we are running through it really quickly. I just want to make sure that this was not forgotten, but we're not going to dwell on it either. And we're going to go to like some of the more immediately relevant stuff, which is the various verbal stems. So if you recall from our previous session, there are 7 of them: the kal, the pl, the hifil, the nifal, the pual, the hofal, and the hitpael. Well, there's actually more than 7 stems. These are the 7 most common stems. But most of the ones you'll run into will be one of these 7. And of these 7, by far the most common is the kal stem, because that is the simplest of them. And we'll be learning a lot about the kal. And once we master the kal, we will deal with the other stems, or binyanim as they're called in Hebrew, because learning the kal will give you the groundwork that you need for the rest of them. So if you recall, how we parse a verb is we identify which binyan it is, and then we identify if it's a perfect, imperfect, verb consecutive, perfect, verb consecutive, imperfect, etc. And then we also find out it's first, second, third person, or masculine or feminine, or singular or plural. So to use an existing example, let's say we got tala right here. That's a kal. That's a perfect. It's a third person singular. And then let me see. Vaishkach, that is a Vav consecutive. In Vav consecutive. It's also a Kal, and it's third person singular from Shachach. It means to forget. So, yeah, it's important to know how to parse a verb because that is one of the main ways that you identify what's going on when you're reading a text in Hebrew. You want to know who's doing an action, what sort of action they're doing, and who is the recipient of the action. And that's the kind of information that's going to be important for learning that. Now, the call is being used as the template here, and it's the template because it's the simplest form. Once you've learned the call as a template, you'll be able to more easily identify the different forms of the other verb stems. Here is a table showing you all the different potential forms of the kal stem using the verb katal as the main verb. So katal is to kill, just FYI. So these are all the possible forms that verb can take in the kal stem. Now, we're not going to learn all of this all at once. We're going to take baby steps, which is why for this session, you're only going to learn the perfect, which is the first column over here. In subsequent sessions, we'll learn the other forms that we see right here. And this is important because once you master the kal verb, then you will learn the rest more easily. So if we cover the nifal, the hofal, the pual, etc., we can just take this and and then parse accordingly. There are only going to be 4 forms for each stem that actually will need to be memorized. So with any language, any language with verb conjugations, you do need to memorize the different forms of the verb. So with Hebrew, you're going to need to memorize this table. So take a good look at it because you will become well acquainted with it over the next few sessions. Once you memorize this, then the rest will come much more easy. So you'll see here the next table. It's how to generate a table from the 4 key forms. Don't need to worry about that for now. We'll move to discussing the kal perfect. So kal means simple in Hebrew, and it's called the kal because it's the most basic form of the verb. Sometimes it's also called the pa'al because all of the verbs take the pa'al form, but kal is the term that has gained traction in Hebrew grammar. So by far most of the verbs that you'll run into, in fact, almost all the ones we've dealt with up to this point have been the kal form. I think there was one PL, but that was the exception. So it's both the simplest and the most common, which makes it very convenient for us so we can focus on learning this. So the kal perfect is often used to depict past tense. So in Hebrew grammar, verbs tend to be aspect based rather than tense based. And the 2 main aspects are perfective and imperfective. That's why we have the kal perfect and the kal imperfect. And the general difference between the 2 is one has to do with completed action and one has to do with incomplete action. They roughly map onto our ideas of past, present, and perfect, but not entirely. And we'll see shortly how something can be perfective and yet future. So as it does say here, there are places where a perfect verb can be can be translated as present or future tense in English. Yeah, I mean that if it's in a perfect verb in Hebrew. By far the most common place where this happens is in the prophetic passages various um, in various books of the Bible. So in Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. And in fact, I can show you an example right now. So let's take a look at just one passage of scripture really quickly. Um, Let me blow this up, and let's go to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5. All right. Ki yalad yulad lanu benitan lanu vatihi ha misra al shikmo vayikra shmo peleetz el gibor aviad sar shalom. You may know this in English as the passage which goes, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. So notice something in this passage. Vatihi and Vaikra. All right, so these are Vav consecutive perfects. And normally in, say, a historical or a narrative section, these would be translated as past tense. However, this is prophetic, so it's referring to something in the future. So the Vav consecutive in this case is going to be translated as a future. So Vatihi will be translated as will be, and he will be, it will be rather. And Vaikra will be translated as he will be called, or they will call his name. These are referring to actions that will take place in the future from the perspective of Isaiah. However, because it is thought of as being good as done, it's rendered as perfect tense. So it is, in a sense, a completed action in the future. Yeah. Sorry, I said it's a Vav consecutive. It's actually Vav consecutive imperfect, not perfect. A Vav consecutive imperfect is a Vaital form, whereas a Vav consecutive perfect is a Vakatal form. You can see why I prefer using Vaital and Vakatal. It's much easier to use those terms. So a Vav consecutive perfect, as the name implies, has the V or the Vav consecutive before it. And when it appears, it will be the opposite of its form without the Vav. So he kept versus and he will keep. She slept and she will keep. They kept and they will keep. So the will there tells you that the aspect changes somewhat when the V is added. So, in summary, the perfect is a complete action in the mind of the speaker. The perfect is generally past, but can be present or future. And now that we know what the perfect is and what it conveys, we can talk about how what the different forms of the perfect are and how to identify them. And for that, we need to learn a word. It's sufformative. A sufformative is kind of like a suffix in that it's an extra letter that's added at the end of the word. But the difference between a sufformative and a suffix is that the suffix is still technically considered separate from the word, whereas a sufformative, when it's added onto a basic word stem, it becomes part of the word itself. So the examples here would be these. So let's use the word shamar or to guard as the example. So the basic form would be shamar. He guarded or he kept. If we were saying she guarded or kept, it would be shamra. If it was you guarded, it would be shamarta. If it's you, but it's a feminine you, it's shamart. I guarded or I kept is shamarti. the plural form, they kept or guarded, is shamru. And then you guarded or kept would be shamartem, unless you are a group of women, in which case it's shamarten. Note that this form is relatively rare because there are very few places in the Bible where a group of women is being addressed in the second person. Nevertheless, it does happen, and for that reason, this form exists. And finally, we guarded or kept is shamarnu. So again, shamar, shamra, shamarta, shamart, shamarti, shamru, shamartem, shamarten, shamarnu. When you're learning Hebrew, they teach you to basically say that table out loud multiple times until it becomes second nature. Second nature, and you're able to say it without thinking, and you know what each one means right away. The difference between a between a sufformative and a sufformative and a suffix can best be explained this way. So let me do this. So let's say I write you guarded. Okay, so it's gonna look like this. So we're gonna put the so shamarta. It's like you guarded. On the other hand, if I want to say he guarded you, it could be there's a way to we usually use the et, but there's a way to say it without the et, which is to add the object the object suffix directly onto the verb. That doesn't happen very often in biblical Hebrew, but it is a thing that does happen. So it would look something like this. It'll be something like shamarcha. It's like he guarded you, versus here it's you guarded. Notice this one has a second person masculine singular sufformative, and this one has a second person singular masculine suffix. I'm just showing you this to make the point that a suffix and a sufformative are not the same, and you should not confuse the two. When you're starting off in Hebrew, you might mistake them for each other, but over time it should become natural for you to distinguish them. So here's an example of the differences. So shamarta, so ta, ich, t, sorry, ta, cha, t, ich, ti, I, tem, chem, tem, chen, nu, enu. So you'll notice that they're fairly different from each other. The most similar ones will be the first person singular and the first person plural. So the first person singular sufformative is t, whereas the first person singular suffix is e. The difference is the tav right there. And the really tricky one is the plural form, because the main difference, as you can see here, is the accent and the vowel that's attached. So this is a subtle difference, but you have to make note of it. Otherwise, you may mistake the two for each other. You don't want to say that you don't want to mistake we guarded for he guarded us, if that makes any sense. So now that we got that out of the way, here's some notes that we should remember. So don't be surprised that third parent singular is also similar to nouns. So if you recall, the ending for the third person singular is a is basically a kamet's he, and that's similar to the ending that we have for a lot of feminine nouns. But you shouldn't have too much trouble distinguishing them from each other because you can easily tell that something is a verb instead of a noun from context. But this actually makes it easy to have nouns and verbs agree with each other because they will have the same endings. If I say the queen guarded, it would be Shamra Malka. They both have the ending, and you can tell that there is subject verb agreement easily from that. So so basically, you want to memorize this table. And this is already recited for you using the verb shamar. This just shows it to you with the verb katal. Um, Hebrew textbooks like the word katal for some reason. It basically means to kill. So you're going to learn he killed, she killed, you killed, I killed, we killed, you killed, we all killed, everyone killed. Yeah, it's katal, katla, katalta, katalt, katalti, katlu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. Read over this table multiple times and try to recite it as often as you can until you can do it without looking at the table. And for each one that you recite, you should know exactly what it is. If it's masculine or singular, first, second, third person, singular, plural. So this is the part of learning Hebrew that involves the most memorization. So, get used to memorizing tables such as this. Now, the Kal perfect can be both an active or a stative. An active verb is basically a verb where the subject is doing an action, whereas a stative verb is one where the subject is being described by that verb. So, an example of an active verb would again be katal, he killed, or shamar, he kept or guarded. A stative verb would be something like gadal, which means he was great. So this isn't describing something he did, it's describing something that he is. He is great. Kaved, he was heavy. Katon, he was small. So this is one of the interesting things about Hebrew verbs is that it doesn't always describe action, it can also describe state. So these are examples of stative verbs, and we'll see many more such cases down the road. So in a Kal perfect, the first syllable is always an A-class vowel. You can see that they all have little comets at the bottom. And then the second syllable, the vowel is more variable. Here we have a patach, as well as here. But here we have a tzere, and here we have a cholem. So this will, this is basically a variable element in these verbs. So it says, as it says here, Kal perfects in which a subject is performing action or an active verb always have an A-class vowel in the second syllable. So if this is a patach, there's a good chance that that's an action verb, but that's not always the case. You can see that gadal, despite being a stative verb, also has a patach. So stative verbs can have any vowel in the middle. So if you see that the second root letter has a vowel other than a patach or kametz, you know that it's a stative verb. So The caveat here is that this may not necessarily apply to verbs where one of the root letters drops out. So for he came, it's ba, or he died, it's met. So there's supposed to be another root there, a root letter, but it drops out when you get the third person singular form. So ba comes from ba'a, which is spelled bet aleph tav. Met comes from mut, which the radical is. The roots are mem vav tav. You can see right here. Oh, sorry, I got the root for ba wrong. It's actually bet vav aleph. The vav at the middle drops out, as you can see. So here are the different call perfects, and here's the difference between a call perfect active and a call perfect stative. You can see that an I class vowel stative kaved, you got kavda, kavadat, kavadta, kavadti. Basically, in this case, the middle radical turns back into an A class, so it turns back into patach. In the U class, it remains a U class. So katonta, katont, katonti. And here it's katontem, katonten. So this is this comments makes the O sound rather than the A sound. And if you know that this is if it has that it has a holem in the basic form, then you will learn to anticipate this. So distinguishing between a call perfect and a noun. So this harkens back once again to the noun changes that we've been talking about. So the main difference is that the call perfect has a historical A-class vowel in the first syllable. So that is why this has always been a comments. So there's not necessarily a vowel change involved in why it is the way it is. Whereas in a lot of nouns, even if it has a comments at the beginning, it may have turned into a comments as a result of the vowel changes that we discussed all the way back in chapter 5. So how do you know the right vowel to use in any given context? And that's basically determined by context. So yeah, this is a little bit advanced. Don't worry too much about this. I'm just skimming through it really quickly. Here it's showing how the syllabication is different between the nouns and the verbs. Ochla for is the word here for like something that is eaten. Now, if I were to say she ate, it'd be achla. So the mitheg, which is that little vertical line, is used to distinguish between them in some cases, but it's often not used in actual Hebrew texts. So we're not going to dwell on that. Anomalies in vowels. Again, this is fairly advanced material. We don't have to worry about this too much. We'll skip that. Now, one other thing that I want to cover before we conclude would be irregular roots. So you will know that something is a noun. Something is a perfect by the fact that it has no preformative. So So if it's added at the end of a verb, it is a subformative. It's added at the beginning, it is a preformative. And perfect nouns always have a subformative and never a preformative. An imperfect always has a preformative, and it may or may not have a subformative. So examples of perfect nouns would be katlu and ba'u. Notice that they both have the subformative shurek vav at the end. And then by contrast, the imperfect forms yiktol and yavo. We will learn what the imperfect forms are in the next session. We're not going to cover that for now. But here you have the yod with the hirek and then yod kamets at the beginning. That is the basic preformative for a third person singular masculine verb. So yeah, once you see that the preformative is on a verb, you know right away that's an imperfect. So there are irregular forms as well of various verbs. These are what you call weak verbs. They're called weak because a radical drops out. So here are some examples. Ba'a, khatata. Actually, bata is the perfect example of it. So you'll remember that the form for to come is bo. So once we actually form different verbs with it, the verb drops out. So ba is he came, and ba ta is the form for she came, like that. So typically with these imperfect weak verbs, you learn that certain vowels have a strong tendency. Sorry, certain consonants have a strong tendency to drop out in certain forms. Another good example is actually Natan, and we won't dwell on this too much for now because the noon sometimes drops out, but usually drops out in the imperfect form. So if I say he will give, it will be yiten. So notice that the noon drops out. It's and then the preformative yod takes its place in this form, like this. So with those irregular roots, for now, you just need to know that they exist, and you will eventually learn to identify them. Once you know what they are, they're fairly easy to recognize, but if you're starting off, they may cause a little bit of trouble because you find a verb and you don't know necessarily what the roots are. Let's say you ran into the word yiten for the first time. Now, if you're not familiar with the word natan and its forms, you might think, oh, what is the yod there part of its root, or no? And if it's not, then what is the missing root? You might be confused as to what it will be. So this is where learning the vocabulary is actually important, because once you've learned that form natan exists, you'll know how to identify its irregular forms. So that's more or less it for this session. So to wrap it up, it's very important for you to learn the different forms of the kal. I encouraged everyone at the beginning to get their own copy of the textbook. If not, you can always just pause the video whenever I show a table, and you can try to memorize it that way. But try your best to memorize these tables because they are going to be essential to learning Hebrew verbs. And I'm I am done with this session. This is what we'll cover next session, the call imperfect. So um, looking forward to that.
All right. Thank you for that, Lewis. And I think we also have another show scheduled coming up Saturday. I believe it's at 12 p.m. Central. Let me double check. But yeah.
Right. Oh, yes, that is right. We are continuing the Bible commentary series after a several month hiatus. I'm very excited about that as well.
I think First Kings, First Chronicles, and right.
It's more like First Kings and the first half of Second Chronicles. It's a little bit tricky because so First Chronicles maps onto all of Second Samuel, whereas the content for First and Second Kings, both of them map onto Second Chronicles. So if we're covering only First Kings, we're only covering maybe the first 18 chapters or so of First Chronicles.
Awesome. And is there any plug that you want to put in for anything else that you're working on and want to make everybody?
Not at the moment, but we do have. I have been talking to some people who may potentially be coming into reason and theology down the road. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to help to bring in some new guests, Lord willing.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking forward to the next one. And everybody just kind of stay tuned. I'll put a date on YouTube pretty soon for the next one that we'll do, continuing this basics of biblical Hebrew. So stay tuned for that. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. Also, check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support what we're doing here. I think that's going to do it. We'll see y'all later. God bless.
All right.
Hello, RNT fans. I am really excited to say that Reason and Theology is an affiliate of Verbum, a Catholic study Bible program. If you want more tools to access theological and historical and biblical aspects of your faith, be sure to check out reasonandtheology.com/verbum, where you'll get a 10% discount on packages in addition to 5 extra books. Once again, reasonandtheology.com